Okay, so Run for Your Life lesson 7, I think we're on to now. The main topic today is control of heartbeat, but we'll also be looking at VO2 max, a little bit of aerobic fitness too. What we're looking at for C grade here, these terms, we call them being of these, so VO2 max, cardiac output, stroke volume, SAN, AVN and myogenic, that's for C grade. For B grade, I've made a little bit of an error here, so to describe how the normal electrical activity of the heart brings about contraction, how that brings about the cardiac cycle overall. And then for A and A star, what we're looking at is relating ECG traces to the electrical activity of the heart, so being able to say what's happening at each stage of an ECG trace, and then ultimately describe an ECG when the heart has some defects, so coronary heart disease or fibrillation or whatever. Okay, I haven't done your specification part yet, so I'll just put this in here. So from the spec, it should look something like this. Yeah, okay, so understand that cardiac muscle is myogenic and describe normal electrical activity of the heart, including the roles of the SAN, the AVN, and the bundle of His, and how we can use electrocardiograms to aid the diagnosis of CVD and other heart conditions. Okay, I said we're going to talk about VO2 max. So first of all, let's have a look at aerobic fitness. So what aerobic fitness is, we looked at anaerobic last lesson. What aerobic fitness is how well the body can take in and use oxygen, and that's what VO2 max is. Basically the volume, that's where the V comes from, of oxygen, O2, that can be taken in and used under maximal effort, really. So the maximum amount of oxygen you can take in and use during exercise. Excuse me. So you can see that it's measured in millilitres per minute per kilogram. So per kilogram of body weight, that is, millilitres taken in per minute per kilogram of body weight. In order to measure it, you need to exercise to absolute exhaustion and be hooked up to a gas analyzer so it can record how much oxygen has been taken out of the air. Generally, the maximum level that they take out is when they fail to exercise anymore. So they'll be on a treadmill, they stop, and at that point that's usually their VO2 max. Although highly trained athletes will often go beyond their VO2 max, their oxygen consumption will actually drop off and they'll still be exercising, they'll just be in anaerobic activity. So I've put here, it's either the point at which they quit or where their oxygen consumption peaks, because often you'll get a graph that goes up and up with the exercise intensity and just peaks off like that. And so that point there, the highest point will be the VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen they can take in and use. As you increase your fitness, with training or whatnot, your VO2 max will increase, and the higher your VO2 max, the greater the intensity of exercise you can exercise at before you're exhausted. Okay, quick video just to show you it in action. I think it's from the University of Bath. It's a fella conducting the VO2 max test. He annotates a little bit about what he's doing and why he's doing it. But actually, have a listen to this.
The VO2 max test is a test of maximal oxygen consumption, and it's a test that we use to assess aerobic fitness or endurance fitness. What it'll involve is the subject running on the treadmill, and we record all the oxygen that they use, and we also measure some of their blood parameters whilst they're running. From that, we can look at how aerobically fit they are. The data we need prior to the start, really, I think it's the same for all sorts of physiological assessments, in that we'd need your age, your sex, your height and your weight, and then we'd take some baseline measurements such as resting blood lactate and hematocrit and hemoglobin, which are just normal baseline blood scores, and then we would progress into the test itself. Great work, great effort, it's good. The test should take round about 20 minutes, that's what we aim for. It will vary dependent on the fitness of the athlete.
Great work, we're nearly there.
The way it works is that it's an incremental step test.
Seconds.
So it starts off gradually and progressively gets harder up to the point where the athlete says they can't do any more, and we stop the test there. If we get a a range of data. Obviously we get the VO2 max, which is a figure of how much oxygen the person who's done the test can use when they're working as hard as they can. And as I said, that's an indication of their aerobic fitness. We also get a range of blood-related variables, such as blood lactate, which indicate how hard the person's feeling, how hard the exercise is whilst they're doing the test. And that's something that can be influenced by training. So that's where you would see an improvement if people were to do retests. The people who tend to get the better scores are endurance athletes, but it really has quite an important role in team sports as well. And as a general measure of fitness, away from sporting populations, it's one of the most important parameters that people would want to have assessed.
Okay, so VO2 max being a measure of the amount, the volume of oxygen you can take in and use, and maximally. It's obviously dependent on your body's ability to deliver oxygen to the tissue. So it's dependent on your respiratory system and more so your cardiac system, the ability of your heart to pump blood around your body. And that leads into the next topic really, which is cardiac output. Now you may have done a little bit of this in year 12, but we'll see. What cardiac output is basically the amount or the volume of blood that's pumped out of the heart in 1 minute. Now in most people that's around about 5 decimeters cubed per minute. Decimeter cubed is the unit they use to describe it. It's basically 1 decimeter cubed is 1 litre. That should be superscript, but for some reason it doesn't translate as superscript on here. So average is about 5 litres per minute that your heart can pump out of one side of it. So usually it's measured out the left side of the heart. How that's calculated, or what determines it, is the stroke volume. That's how much is pumped for each beat, and then the heart rate. Obviously the more times the heart beats, the more blood is going to be pumped. So stroke volume of blood pumped out of the left side of the heart with each beat, usually it's between 50 and 90 centimeters cubed at rest. But then obviously when you start exercising, that's going to change. Now the size of stroke volume, so how much you pump out per beat, it varies from person to person, but ultimately the main things determine it are the strength of the contraction, so the harder the heart's pumping, the more volume is going to go out, and what's called venous return. Now venous return is how much blood has been brought back to the heart through the veins. When you're exercising hard, more blood returns to the heart because more has been pumped out, because everything's flowing a lot faster. You tend to get more blood returning through the veins. The more blood does return through the veins, the greater the filling of the atrium and the ventricles, and so the more blood gets pumped out. When you're resting, there's less venous return, so the ventricles and the atria don't fill quite as much as under exercise conditions. So venous return, strength contraction, they're the two things determine that you get a greater venous return when you're exercising. Okay, heart rate. Well, we've done heart rate before, I'm sure. It's based on the number of beats per minute. You know it's usually lower the fitter you are, so trained athletes tend to have a much lower resting heart rate than untrained people. So Miguel Indurain was quite a famous winner of the Tour de France. His resting heart rate was 28 beats a minute. So that's like less than a beat every 2 seconds, which is crazy. But generally, an athlete you're talking would have, on average, I think it's about 65 beats a minute for an athlete. But they can't, when I was at university, mine was on about 50, because I was an endurance trained athlete. So endurance athletes tend to have lower resting heart rates just because their stroke volume tends to be greater, so they don't have to pump quite as many times to get the same cardiac output. An approximation of your maximum heart rate is 220 minus your age, roughly, although I have seen some things on the web recently saying it's 230 minus your age, but always used to be 220. And then just a reminder, cardiac output then is the stroke volume, so how much the volume of blood pumped each beat multiplied by the heart rate gives you your cardiac output. That's that's definitely possible as coming up in the exam. That's something you're going to need to know, and I don't think they provide you with the equation in that circumstance. Okay, a little bit about cardiac muscle. You did do this in year 12, but a couple of things about it. Cardiac muscle, the only place you find cardiac muscle is in the heart. Okay, and it is unique. It's kind of a cross between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. So you get a smooth muscle in your arteries and in your digestive system and so on, which is not under your control, where skeletal muscle is what causes you to move. We did it earlier on in the unit. Cardiac muscle is kind of a cross between the two, so it is very, very strong, but it never gets tired. So smooth muscle doesn't get tired, neither does cardiac muscle. It just keeps going and going and going. A key word, it's myogenic. And what that means is that it generates its own contractions. It will contract on its own. If you have some cardiac tissue, like you've grown a petri dish, it will just sit there and twitch. It just contracts of its own accord. That's what myogenic means. Obviously, it'd be no good if your heart did that. If it's just contracting, all the cells is contracting at their own pace. It needs to have a rhythm in order to pump the blood from the atria to the ventricles, and then from the ventricles out to the rest of the body. So we have this thing called the SA node, the sinoatrial node, which helps sort out the pace so that it all contracts in a right rhythm and we get the more sufficient transfer of blood through the atria, through the ventricles, and then out through the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. Right, this is a quick recap of the cardiac cycle with the usual American accents that you get on videos. Just to recap things from year 12 that you should hopefully have remembered, and if you haven't, then obviously stop this, pause it, go back as you need to, just to make sure you're clear on the events and how the cardiac cycle works.
Ventricular contraction causes the atrioventricular valves to close, which signals the beginning of ventricular systole. The semilunar valves were closed during the previous diastole and remain closed during this period. Continued ventricular contraction increases pressure in the ventricles above the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary trunk, causing the semilunar valves to open. When the ventricles relax and their pressures drop, blood flowing back toward the relaxed ventricles causes the semilunar valves to close, which is the beginning of ventricular diastole. Note that the atrioventricular valves remain closed. When the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in the atrioventricular valves open and blood flows into the relaxed ventricles. This accounts for most of the ventricular filling. The atria then contract and complete the ventricular filling.
Okay, so the challenging part of today really is understanding how the cardiac cycle is controlled. As you know already, hopefully from the last video, you can see that first of all the atria contract and then the ventricles contract. Now there's a reason why it happens in that order. As I said, heart muscle is myogenic, it will contract on its own, but we have this thing, the sinoatrial node, which is key in terms of setting the pace. They sometimes call it the pacemaker. It's the heart's own pacemaker, and it's found here. You can see on the diagram. That's your SA node. Now, how this works, basically, it sends out electrical impulses, so it depolarizes at a set rate, and that's under control. It will do it on its own without the nervous system, but the nervous system does have an influence on it in order to speed it up or slow it down. But even without nervous system input, it just sends out these waves of depolarization of its own. Now, how it works, what you have a layer of insulating cells in the heart across here which divide the atria and the ventricles up. Now when the sinoatrial node, the SA node, depolarizes, it sends out a wave of depolarization in all directions across the atria. Now because they're myogenic, because they're contractile, that wave of depolarization causes them to contract. So the atria contract, and therefore blood is going to be pushed from the atria down into the ventricles. Okay, so they're going to contract from the top up. So this part will contract top down, squeezing blood down into the ventricles. What's then going to happen is you have here in the septum something called the AV node. The AV node will pick up this electrical stimulation and it'll hold on for it for 0.1 of a second. After that, it's then going to travel down through the septum, through something called the bundle of His. It'll travel down there. The bundle of His is a conducting fibre. It'll travel down there and onto what's called the Purkinje fibres. Can you see that? Purkinje fibres. Now the Purkinje fibres run up the side of the ventricles like this. Okay. Sometimes that's called Purkine, so just watch out for that in the exams. Purkine or Purkinje. Either way, they're conducting material. It's a conducting material, so the electrical impulse runs down and then up from the bottom of the ventricles. What then happens is that the ventricles contract from the bottom upward, and therefore blood is squeezed from the bottom of the heart up and out, okay, to the lungs, to the body. Alright, if I can just try to draw it. So effectively you've got your heart, layer of insulating cells along here, SA node. What's going to happen, you've got your wave of depolarisation again spreading across the whole of the atria, causing the atria to contract. You've then got here the AVN, the AV node or the AVM, whatever they want to call it. That one's the SAN, isn't it? That's going to hold onto it for 0.1 of a second, as I just said, and then the wave of depolarisation will travel down the bundle of His and then up the Purkinje fibres, both sides, causing the heart to then contract from the bottom up. So top down in the atria, bottom up in the ventricles, blood ultimately, I'm not sure it's going to show up on here, is it? No. But the blood ultimately travels from the atria down the ventricles and then up and out. Atria down the ventricles, up and out. That's how your cardiac cycle is controlled.